The Dunning Africa Center. It's not a place, it's a continent-wide conversation. We shift our focus to the central theme of this month's webinar. Our distinguished panelists and hosts are drawn from across the world and work in business, academia, and government. Join us as we ask the pressing questions facing African business today.
Wonderful, and welcome to yet another Dunning Africa Center webinar on timely subjects that matter to everyone. And on this occasion, our theme is going to be global value chains and the new geopolitical world order. Where does Africa fit in? Now, this is obviously an evolving subject because for the last year, we've been seeing a process whereby the world seems to be getting reorganized. We don't want to get into the politics of this reorganization, just to accept that this is happening. Now, as a curiosity, I've been giving a talk in different countries about this particular theme, and every 2 or 3 months I've had to entirely change my slides because it's a moving target, and that what makes it quite fascinating. However, we are seeing some semblance of order in the chaos. Which is about time too. I think everybody, especially people in business, people dislike uncertainty. They want to have some sense or direction of how the big pieces at least will fall. Even though we have many concerns still about the smaller side issues. So and I think that it's about time we came and faced the question that this particular issue from the perspective of Africa, and more importantly, because we're a business school, and and this is the subject that interests us a lot, is global value chains. And global value chains are really quite significant. They shape everybody's economy. They integrate us in a global sense, and they have done so for the last 30 years, and they've become more and more integrated. The world has become more and more integrated. So as we move in this anti-globalization world, where will the pieces and where will these value chains, where will these supply chains get truncated? How will they get truncated, and so on? So that's our theme for today, and I've got with me a wonderful set of experts, and in no particular order. In fact, in the order in which they return their bios to us. I have Sam Ogbu, speaking to us today, I think from Lagos, an accomplished CEO, a man of many parts. At one point in time, CEO of Old Mutual West Africa, and now, he has massive experience across real estate, media, asset management, financial services, and so on. He's a man who thinks big and thinks long term, and he would have to, as a CEO, strategically plan. So we've got an insight in that perspective. We have Ziad Hamoui, who's from Ghana, and he starts his bio by saying a committed Pan-Africanist, and I think this is a key point to note. We have several Pan-Africanists in the room today. And we will indeed end up talking about these issues. He leads the Ghanaian Borderless Alliance, which is a think tank and advocacy group promoting regional economic integration and tackling barriers to trade and transport. He himself is a chartered logistician and very active. He's a man of many parts. So we're delighted to have him join us. Thomas de Berg joins us from the United States, he has a big enough budget to go for a tie, so we are pleased to have the tie as well. And Assistant Professor of Strategy and International Business. Now, I should say that Thomas is one of these intellectuals who puts his words in the right place, and he thinks about them. And he's done considerable field work across Central Africa. I won't go into the details of it, but when it comes to understanding how GVCs function across Africa, um, he's spent a huge amount of time studying this issue. So I'm really grateful to have him. And last but by no means least, we have Roland Maposa, who is also yet another intellectual, also a Pan-Africanist who spends a lot of time thinking about issues to do with the African continental free trade area. I would say that's his key specialist, but again, much concerned about Africa's economic development and takes an interdisciplinary work to understanding different aspects of sustainable development. So, without further ado, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. And I think we're going to have an interesting conversation. So, let me just start off by setting up for the audience briefly what is our premise for this conversation. What the premise is this: we have what is emerging and what seems to be the status quo now is that we will have two dominant blocks or economic centers of gravity, let's call them. And one will be a US based economic center of gravity. And we have a second one, which is a China dominated center of gravity. At some point in time, people were talking about a third such block, but for various reasons, which we won't go into today, that doesn't seem to be the case. So right now we have two, and then we have a bunch of what we can call unaligned countries. Unaligned countries being sort of neither really in or either of the two. And in with this group is much of sub-Saharan Africa, much of Central Asia, Middle East, and so forth. Um, and some, and we're not really sure about Central and South America right now, but we are still in the process. But for certain, in the middle, the underlying group, Sub-Saharan Africa is solidly in there. I think these are not disputable facts. Um, and Sub-Saharan Africa matters, and I think matters a lot, as we all know, from a point of view of resources. But it tends to be stuck in the lower end of the GVCs, that is supplying raw materials, natural resources, to some extent, labor to both blocks. Now, the question really comes to, can you really be in two blocks at the same time? Can you really play both sides? And people ask this question, and I think we are here to at least point us in the right direction. And that's what my brilliant team of people here are going to discuss. Maybe I think the place to start off is to give Thomas the chance to explain a little bit in layman's terms what GVCs are about, so that we understand this is our main unit of analysis. Thomas.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. And kind of giving some background about GVCs, how they developed, and essentially sort of what's the logic behind them, and then kind of thinking about Africa's place in them is a good place to begin. So, as Prof kind of alluded to, right, we're looking back to the 1990s, early 2000s, when global value chains are really starting to develop. It's during a period of rapid globalization. I think important to our conversation, it's a period of what they consider to be sort of unipolarity in the global order at that time. And really it's the process by which, the way in which industries value adding activities from the primary stages all the way up through the intermediate and final stages were becoming increasingly de-integrated and dispersed across many countries around the world. And really the role of different countries within the GVC and the specific activities located in one country as opposed to another really depends upon a country's comparative advantages, or essentially what each country can best offer based upon their natural and human resources as inputs into the value chain. I think it's also important to note that sort of the drive for activities in terms of where they're located is typically also on the basis of cost minimization. So large multinationals are able to minimize costs by locating each stage to the countries where those activities are done most efficiently and at the lowest costs. So now, from the perspective of multinationals, which are oftentimes the lead firms in structuring how the global value chains are organized, their specific advantages for organizing things in this way also is based upon their ability to leverage large amounts of control over a global value chain without necessarily having to incur the costs of ownership or the burdens of responsibility for all these different steps of the value chain. So it's quite different from, your traditional foreign direct investment, the old model whereby companies were very vertically integrated across all their activities. And in this way, they're able to avoid some of those costs and commitments, as well as potentially risky investments. Certainly in certain host countries, that can be the case. So thinking about how Africa fits into this picture, then I think we can first think about the long-term historical trajectory, think about especially the colonial legacy, whereby African countries, as we was kind of alluded to, were really positioned as sources of raw materials. So whether it's the precious metals and minerals found in several countries, crude oil from Angola, Algeria, and Nigeria, or agricultural products like cotton, cocoa, coffee, tea, palm oil, etc., right? Those were the sort of primary inputs that the African countries were contributing to these emergent global value chains, right? And so beyond that, the development of their African role in GVCs has not really developed much beyond sort of provider of raw materials or otherwise very sort of lower level activities within the value chain. And so even if you look at UN trade data, they show that Africa's share of global output in terms of value added only increased from like 1.8% in 1990 up to only 2.7% in 2023. So across the span of, over 30 years, only very, very minor increases in terms of Africa's value added to global value chains. So it's maintained this sort of lower level position. And on the other hand, I think as we'll talk about, right, the flip side of what some would call a resource curse is that some of these raw materials that we're talking about are not only very important strategically in the global economy and also from a geopolitical perspective, but also that African countries are sometimes sort of a primary or predominant sources of some of these resources that we'd be talking about. So this question, brings up this idea of strategic importance as to how this.
Yeah, that is exactly where we need to talk about. I want to broaden then the conversation a little bit because I think that perhaps this is an important point for us to make to the room is that the amount of value adding that goes beyond resource extraction is really quite small. Africa comes to the table with a fairly small engagement with value adding, adding value to the natural resources. So we export raw materials. Now, and that I think is one of the things that someone once upon a time, very long time ago, told me that there is something called the golden rule. And I said, what's that? He said, the golden rule is he who has the gold makes the rules. And I've said, no, many of you have heard me say this before, but it's such an important piece of information. I've realized that now you can make an addendum to this. He who has the gold or the guns makes the rules, because you can actually make rules if you have guns. Don't ask me how I know this, but this is an important point. Is that when one goes to bargain, one has to bargain with something, and I think this is the first rule of business: is that a deal has to be. If the deal has to be struck, it is about knowing what you have to offer and what you are willing to exchange for. You should know what you have to bring to the table. And that, I think, is the issue of strategic importance. What are we, if we are going to say, what are our choices? Um, so how do we decide? Because now we have the situation, and that's where we are going to go. Is what do we demand? What do we ask for? And more importantly, what are we offering in exchange for that? And let me start off with the kind of the last day before yesterday, the president of Zambia said, we don't have to bargain. We should talk to both sides, because strategic importance is, people will come to us because we are important. Now, I'm not entirely certain about that. This is something perhaps, Sam, what do you think about this? What is strategic importance in this context?
Um, in a sense, we have the potential for strategic importance. When I look at it, we have strategically important materials, even though I take your point, in terms of adding value, we don't bring a lot to the table as it seems. But that value chain starts with what we have. So that, in a sense, you can't ignore the place where 30% of the critical minerals live, the place where you have just the demographic reality of Africa is that we are a potentially huge young market. I don't use the word dividend because whether it's a dividend or not depends on what you do. And I'm not sure that we've quite turned it into a dividend yet, but we still have that potential. So if you're planning, if you're a business person, if you're planning, you're scouring the world to look at, okay, so how am I going to get into whatever, deliver value, deliver to my colleagues? I don't think you can ignore Africa. What part it plays is what the issue is, and what part that Africa plays, and we're at an interesting time. Thomas was talking about the logic of GVCs hitherto being efficiency and cost optimization. One would argue that what we've seen since COVID, at least, is that is being questioned. And I think in that lies an opportunity, because now you're looking at resilience, now you're looking at other factors, some of which Africa, I have to say, is still very bad at, because one of them is reliability. But with that development, with the changes in the energy, for example, in sort of the energy mix, and also the climate issues, Africa is a very important element. Whether that makes it, how it plays that card is another matter. But we can't ignore that it does have a card to play.
Yeah. I think Roland is going between shaking his head and nodding his head. So go for it, Roland.
Thank you, Prof. No, I'm shaking and nodding because my if you wanted to mention, is Africa represented institutionally, so through the AU, which is the body that represents all 55 countries on the continent. It does the unseen work, if you want, because this is policy being a public good. It's not the thing that looks shiny, but it's the thing that keeps everything together. So what's reassuring, I think, from the perspective of sort of a research perspective, is that Africa is doing the things it needs to do from layering the foundations, and has been doing. So it's the case of I guess perhaps using it, or making better use of what we have to inform a position for Africa in this new reality, if you want.
So okay, so I mean, this is the question: are we talking about Africa as a bloc? And everyone makes this mistake. I think that we have Africa as a single unit. Surely not everybody is equally strategically important, and not everything has the same kind of context. But I do take your point, and let me bring Ziad in here. to answer this question about as a single force or as a who amongst us is less important, or what value chain does it matter where gives us bargaining power?
Thank you, Prof, for organizing this and for the great question. So I want to start from an arc, actually. I want to start by the fact that the point of integration is to bring in the smaller units and to transform it into a bigger unit to the benefit of all. But the issue with the integration into larger entities is this loss of sovereignty, which many African states somehow still cling to, maybe for good reasons, maybe for apparently good reasons, but it's not the real reason why countries are failing to build onto this integration which started in the 60s. Remember, all of the African countries started their independence from 1957 onwards, except a couple of countries which were never colonized. But then they are fairly new countries. And so you are bringing all these countries from various colonial backgrounds and various cultures, and you're telling them now integrate into one. And integration doesn't just work with rhetoric. It doesn't just feed on rhetoric. If you compare that, for example, to one of the most known economic integration stories, the European Union, they started in 1944 as a union of 3 countries after World War II, who decided to build this union on the basis of coal and steel. So they thought that bringing their resources together and managing them in a similar, consistent way will bring in benefits to all of these 3 countries. And then later on, the Treaty of Rome came up in the 50s with a larger number of countries, and then they built on that, adding value chains, adding rules, regulations, and then starting to come up with a common plan. But it was not just the idea of the unity which kept the unity together. It was the ability to manage the resources in a win-win situation to everyone. And I guess this is what is missing in Africa. Because of the colonization period, most of the infrastructure which were designed in an extractive economy design were not designed to communicate with the various African countries together, but rather with the external partners. And so when we sat down at the table, for example, in 1975 to create the Economic Community of West African States, we assumed that because all of the founding fathers decided that they are going to join their political will and to found an economic community, that things are going to even out at the end. But we forgot that to make this work, you need to connect the roads, the bridges, the airports, the finances, the people, the trade, and all of it. And so it started to build. But then if the moment you leave economic integration, or the moment you leave the concept of economic integration, it will suffer the centrifugal forces, because we are not, honestly speaking, we are not in a friendly or an ideal world. Africa continues to be perceived up to today as the world's exporter of raw material and the consumer of finished products. And so to change this paradigm, you have to look not just at the potential of critical resources we have, or the democracy, or the demographies, but you have to look at what kind of strategic positioning are you going to create out of these various countries. So investors or partners will look at stability, predictability, connectivity, competitiveness, not on a country level, but on a regional level. Do we have them on a country level? And then do we have them on a regional level?
Okay,
so for now, let me just stop here so that we can have more interactions.
Yeah, I think one of the what I want to come to is that, of course, the unsaid point here is that the only way forward for us in terms of being able to bargain at the table is to do more value adding, and giving more value adding gives us more control over commodities. And maybe for the room, the thing about commodities is they're wonderful when the market is up, and they're terrible when the market is
everyone's
down.
in trouble.
And it's a commodity. The word commodity in economics implies something that has no value, that is generic, that everybody has. And if you look at the average prices of commodity cycles, have booms and also have busts. And unfortunately, the busts are bigger than the booms. So if you look at the long-term data, commodities, the return on commodities is less than 5%. Even petroleum, which is famously the best one, the average of 50, 60-year cycles tend to be 5%, 3.5, 4, 5%, thereabouts. They're averaging it out. So there are years and months where you have 100%, 200% return. So I think this is the point, is in the long run, one has to think about it. And in fact, I see already the chat function, people are bringing this up. So adding value has to happen. And we are taking that as a given. So Ziad and I have been discussing this before. And in fact, it's a theme which comes back. It is essential. There isn't any other way around development without investing in adding value and increasing our exports beyond natural resources and doing more. So that's a given. We're taking that as a given. But what I want to come to then is the issue. Yes, what Ziad is bringing up is the fact that maybe as a multilateral effort is the way to go, is trying to go and bargain for something as a group. We are stronger than as units. But then we have people who argue for unilateral action, because after all, politics is local. The elections are won by people whose only people in one country elect. And so therefore, how do you, giving away your sovereignty is giving away power. And as you know, power is addictive. Nobody likes giving it away. Everybody wants more of it. So given that, we have people who see a unilateral approach to build up. Let me build my own country up first, and then worry about other countries. Let me get my GDP, my average person up, and then we can go with others. So does anybody here want to speak for unilateralism? Does this argument make sense? From a political point of view, it does. Let me start with Thomas. This is a Maslow's pyramid. Let me look after myself. He's an anthropologist, by the way, by training, at least one degree. The first reaction to a human being is saying, let me look after my own family first. Why should I be worrying about my neighbors and people miles and miles away from me? Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say not necessarily that I'm a proponent of the unilateral sort of approach to things. I would think that it's likely to be the more sort of realistic outcome of countries within sort of this type of geopolitical landscape that we're seeing. I would say, building on what we've just talked about strategic importance, and that this strategic importance is not necessarily evenly distributed across the different African nations that we're talking about here. That alone kind of lends itself towards individual nations looking out first and foremost for their national interests, right? I think individual countries themselves had long struggled even to benefit from their own natural resource base across different African countries. And so the idea that sort of now trying to seek regional benefits before the national interests strikes me as somewhat unrealistic to a certain extent, right? And so when you think about, again, the basis of strategic importance here is not only the types of resources that are of critical importance to some of these large global powers, United States and China in particular, but also how those are distributed not only on the continent but globally, kind of gives a sense as to what might be the individual countries that need to look out for their own interests first, right? So when you think about resources like cobalt in the DRC, platinum in South Africa, right, where these are the largest sources of these globally, it would be likely that a lot of attention geopolitically is going to be placed on those particular markets. But even other places where the resources might be found in other parts of the world, they're still going to become increasingly important in this geopolitical landscape, right? So, for example, uranium in Niger. So France and Russia have been competing over sort of influence in Niger, in particular for this access to the uranium resources in that country, right? So Russia even has offered to perhaps build a nuclear power plant in the country as a way to gain further influence. And so this would be a potential way within this geopolitical space that a country could leverage the importance of its resource base to try to attract investment, perhaps from both sides, or perhaps catering to one side or the other, as I'm sure we'll talk about. But that's sort of how I would view things, right? Is that, yeah.
No, I see where you're going with this now, but I'm also thinking about, there's something that's in the chat about small countries versus implying the issue of small countries versus large countries. And certainly Nigeria comes to mind as a large country which can afford to be unilateral. Maybe there is that distinction, and that if you are Nigeria, you can say, as unnamed other big countries on the planet and have tended to do, you can make your own rules if you are the big boy in the neighborhood. Sam, obviously this will come to you.
Yes, but if you don't mind, I'll resist that particular red flag. But not to go against an anthropologist's view of human nature or your view, Prof. I think there's one underlying assumption here, and that is that the political agenda is going to drive the economic agenda. It certainly has a part to play, but I'm not sure that I necessarily agree that it is the political actors that are going to determine where we go. If you think about how the global value chains grew, now clearly there was a political element, and foreign policy of large countries tends to be to make the world safe for their business. Absolutely. And it is one thing that African governments, to my mind, have been uniquely lacking in. They have not been making Africa safe for African business. But I think what I'm seeing emerge is that the elected politicians will determine policy to some extent, but they're not executing it. It's the businesses, it's people putting capital that are having allowed a voice about where this goes. And I think that is where I see some hope, because if you've invested money to produce something that is better finished off in Ghana, you started in Nigeria, is better finished off in Ghana, you are going to use whatever influence you have to make sure that particular the unilateralism that will prevent that doesn't happen. So I think we need to inject the role of companies with the role of the corporate sector, the role of organizations such as the development banks, the AFCs of this world and what have you, who are seeing Africa not as a patchwork of sovereign nations, but actually an economic opportunity where everybody can benefit. And I think what they need, we need to see how that helps us in the dialogue.
Yeah. Okay, so I think the point that you are making is a good one. That given the amount of government failure we have across the continent, and no one can deny this, maybe letting businesses take the lead in creating, making a reasonable environment in which business can be conducted, and which includes, of course, acting multilaterally, is something that businesses have the capacity to influence. And this is my paraphrasing, of course. And I'm seeing this as a certainly thing. And I'm coming to the point that Ziad was bringing about ECOWAS. I think he's actually in an ECOWAS meeting as we speak today. ECOWAS is one of those regions where there's been no effect of integration or any kind of increase of trade. I remember looking at data, and at the last 30
We're still
or
at
40
11 to 15% since Dr. Ibn Chambas was the first executive president of ECOWAS. That has been said. It's not something secret. So you are right.
So
But
maybe another what I'm going to come to is that there's a multilateral view that we take smaller and multilateral Africa as a big unit, and I always throw in the possibility of thinking in smaller groups. Maybe the way to think about this is creating the institutional capacity, the infrastructure at a regional area. Of course, ECOWAS belies this effort beyond building a road between, across the continent, one singular road. Go on.
so you
Yeah.
so you see, here's where I want to try to do two things. I want to diverge slightly from what Samuel was talking about with regards to prioritizing the political action which will guide the economic action. Even though tomorrow is 6th of March, Independence Day, and 60 of thy political kingdom has been touted by Kwame Nkrumah when he founded independence. But I personally believe that over politicizing our economic affairs is what led to all of this inertia that we see within ECOWAS, for example. And look, Ghana, for example, as a country, was on par in the 50s and the 60s with Singapore on the same GDP.
Yes.
Flash forward to today, Singapore is one of the highest GDPs of the world. Ghana is still there. Maybe we were over-endowed and that was our curse. It wasn't a blessing. But the reason I'm saying this is to come back to your question. And I wouldn't like to say just because at the ECOWAS level, things did not go the way they were planned, then it means that regional integration does not work. Because obviously it has worked better in other places. So we have to come back to the roots and look at what has worked and what hasn't. And I believe this is where we have to be honest and bold about facing the real issues. Because you see, Prof, if we don't really acknowledge the problem, we can never solve it. One of the main hurdles within ECOWAS is the fact, for example, when it has to do with the CFA as a monetary unit in comparison to the other currencies. The convertibility of the CFA is dependent on an external power outside of the control of ECOWAS. And so such a huge factor, how can you use it to convert into common macroeconomic factors to reach towards the elusive common currency? I mean, I don't want to focus on this particular and elaborate, but I'm just giving an example about misprioritizing our economic development and placing the cart in front of the horse. I think we have to go back to why ECOWAS was founded in the first place as an economic community. It is supposed to provide prosperity and development for economic development for its people. And only then would these same people support and buy into the idea of economic integration to allow you as a politician to move forward with your integration agenda.
So institutional alignment is not necessarily only about perhaps it's too much about political alignment. Maybe the first thing to do is think in simple terms. Right? Sam mentioned the magic word security, that's one of those issues. I remember reading Huntington political science stuff saying what the definition of a nation is a country, a government is the primary role, the basic role of a government is have a monopoly on violence. And that is the fundamental unit of what defines a functioning government, if you will. That's the least thing you're supposed to provide. And okay, in economic terms, this is about transaction costs. If I can go to work and come back in one piece and nobody robs me either at work or on the way to work or the way back from work or carries my goods here and there, this is the most important thing. From transaction costs are minimized. My costs are unnecessary costs. I don't have to hire security guards to walk me to and fro. And we talk, DRC, we talk Nigeria, for different reasons, have different kinds of insecurity. And these are costs. And these are costs that are borne by the business. They end up on your bill. When you go to a restaurant, those are the costs you're paying, the reason why you go to a restaurant in Lagos and you pay the same price you pay in a restaurant in London is, in part, you're paying for security. The cost of having getting the goods from the market, from the farm to the market, and the money back to them, and paying for 30% interest rates and so forth. So let me come to the issue of security. Security as an aspect of institutional infrastructure. And I know I'm aware that I've been holding Roland quiet for a bit, but let me start off with the DRC, and there we have to turn to Thomas. Let's give us an idea of, you've been there. Tell us, does this make sense? Feel free to disagree with me.
I mean, I think the importance of security for DRC in terms of attracting investment and global attention, I think is, I guess to put it simply, right, there's certain interests that would have in mind that a lack of security is better for their purposes than having security, in terms of being able to extract and access resources at a low cost. And that's one of the things about global value chains that I have found to be quite troubling, is that the efficiency logic, can very much be promoting host country instabilities when that turns out to be a favorable circumstance for the cost minimization within the value chain. And so we've seen that in the DRC since the wars began in the 1990s. And so a lack of stability, a lack of the government being able to maintain institutional control over the whole country has been a key part or interests of certain regional and global actors, I suspect. And so part of that might speak to just the particular resource endowment of DRC, which is quite unique and in many ways sort of incomparable to certain parts of the world, which may not be the case in every single marketplace that we're talking about here. But that's how I would think about security. Now, it certainly limits the ability for much more significant value-added activities to ever be incorporated into a country like the DRC, because it's not stable enough for that type of investment, but it's stable enough to extract copper and cobalt in the southern regions. It's stable enough to facilitate sort of a war economy in the eastern parts for other critical minerals. So there's in some sense an interest to not have security when it comes to a country like that. I think you're muted, Prof.
So what you're saying really kind of goes against what I was just suggesting, that businesses take a larger role in creating the institutional setup and so forth. If businesses have an interest in having instability, then there isn't any reason for it to fix anything. And so that what it does is, and one of the kind of the elephant in the room here.
Sorry to interrupt, Prof. I guess I'm partly representing business here. I mean that the DRC situation is exceptional. I don't think it's a template for how business operates. Sure, in other parts of the continent, in other parts of the world, in other parts of even the developed world, we see business misbehaving very badly and behaving exploitatively. But I think the point I was making is that it's not that we should leave it all to business. I'm saying the business needs to have a voice in it, and the providers of capital need to be part of the solution. If we leave it to the politicians, I'm completely at idem with Ziad. If we leave it to just the politics, then I think we are going to have more rhetoric and no execution. If we leave it just to business, we'll get execution, but it may not actually be beneficial. So you actually do need the rules of the game. You need the frameworks. You need constraints and operate in that. But what I'm saying is that there is an opportunity. Those with capital needs to be part of that, because they're the ones who are able to actually create an economy that works. And unfortunately, we're often reduced to a situation of, well, a situation where competence is not rewarded, and efficiency of capital is not rewarded, because of the pervading, overriding influence of the political agenda.
That's interesting. You know, so I mean, Roland, I've been holding on a leash for a bit here, and I'm going to change the direction of the conversation. But Roland, I know you want to say something, so I'm going to, yes, here's your opportunity.
No, thank you, Prof. I think scholars have argued that when you talk about the integration project in Africa, it's anchored, of course, in the Abuja Treaty. And part of the Abuja was the creation of the regional economic communities. Their critique of these is that they are politically led organizations that are seeking to implement sort of economics, which doesn't always work. And then, of course, in the context of Africa, we have the extra burden of the multiple REC memberships for some countries, which just makes it impossible for a country to, or for a business, if you want, to implement, because which policy, whose policy do they take? Because if it's a tariff, whose tariff are they setting? So that inconsistency has not helped. But of course, I'm sure the leaders have sat down and recognized this, and steps, the steps have been taken. So the AFCFTA becomes another tool that seems to aspire to align and to reduce this confusion, creating this environment that Sam alludes to, where a business knows what the rules are for it to function in the continent. So I just thought I'd bring the link.
Well, you know, one of the things that we've been talking about, the main thing we seem to be talking about is multilateralism versus unilateralism. But I think also one of the points that I have been deliberately ignoring, and we have all deliberately ignored, is the fact that we're not masters of our own fate. And I think, in a way, Thomas pointed this out. Who the big powers, we're back to this big powers. The big powers decide also decide who's strategically important. And one of the things that we are seeing happening more and more over the last, not just recently, the last 1 year, but in a longer term, is China and United States are the two big blocs doing things bilaterally. That is to say, making agreements with individual countries, which give them undue influence, shall we say, or excessive influence. And so in a sense, we're not masters of our own fate. Now, I think let me start off with Ziad. I know Ziad does have to exit a little early. He has to go and save ECOWAS. Let me start with Ziad. What's your thoughts on this?
I actually had two ideas, and the first one is about who carries the mandate to represent the good people of Africa with its various partners, inside and outside. Because eventually, at the end of the day, these are the same people who are electing their representatives to achieve their aspirations and objectives. That is part of the pure essence of the politics. So you, as a political entity, are representing your constituents who are businessmen, who are technocrats, who are public servants, who come from all shapes, agriculturists, industrialists, and then you have to take these ideas and turn them into realities. And what do these people want? And this brings us back, or once you solve this question, it brings us back to the main question. What does Africa really want? And when you ask this question, you're not asking what does the politician in Africa want? You're asking what does the average Africa want? Everybody wants prosperity and development. Everybody wants to see themselves in a position of dignity, in a better position of prosperity in the future. And that is why they delegate their constituents to do that on their behalf. So this brings us back to two things. The first one is the value of the social contract between these people and their governments, and then the value of the covenant between the various member states and the regional economic community. And then to bring it back to the continental level, the social contract or the covenant between these states and their representative on the continental level. Because now everybody is saying that once we are together, we are stronger, but then what do we really want? That is the main question. And I think we have to go back to this particular question and to refocus back on the economics which drive the development of these people in the future. And I'm saying this and referring it back to a question I saw earlier in the chat about what is it for MSMEs, for local development of their small chains, right? Eventually, these are the people who would drive your political mandate, because creating opportunities for them at the local level will allow them also to become more vocal on a more international scene. And look, and mind you, not every trader or manufacturer or producer is an exporter. So it's not just about building these up to export. It's just to achieving the kind of economic development that lifts them out of poverty or lifts them above the current state of economic development where they are.
So,
and to do that, you have to create a conducive environment that unlocks this potential.
Yes. So, so we're back to the institutional environment, the stability, issue of stability, security, and so forth. And we accept these are basic human expectations. But to what extent does so if we go, let's put aside the aspiration of multilateral agreement, but the way things are functioning right now, China and Angola, they're friends. Let's take a very tight relationship. If I remember rightly, the loans that Angola has from China, are larger than the GDP of Angola. Now, and that's just the loans. Forget about the FDI and all other things and so forth. Now, to what extent is this a bilateral? This is a unilateral relationship. If again, this is the guns and the gold are in the same place. How do I say, give me more local value adding? How do I get anywhere when the person across the table, the so-called bilateral relationship is actually de facto a unilateral relationship? And in the case of DRC as well, is there any? I saw the news about the United States putting sanctions on Rwanda for the war in the DRC war. This is a unilateral action, and this is not just there, but it's happened in several other places. How do we get away? Forget about multilateral, forget about bilateral. We're looking at unilateral action. How, in a world where such a thing is possible and is happening regularly, where do we go with this, Sam?
Is that really that different from the world we've known before? It may be less subtle, it may be more brash, more brazen, but seriously, I mean, I think that is an opportunity. That's an example of unilateral opportunism, and I think that will continue to exist. You could argue that some of the policies that we've seen from China, amongst others, are of the same ilk. It is unilateral opportunism. If you look at what's happened to the textile economy in South Africa, for example, or in West Africa, those that are here. Where do we go from there? I think it should not derail us from our task of finding how we can move Africa up the curve. Some of it will be actions of the government of a country sitting down with its some of its citizens, with its business community, with its civil community, and saying, how do we map out, how do we create a proper ecosystem for, how do we strengthen our SMEs, how do we, and those things are not just for economic development, those things are to speak to the security. If we don't address those issues of jobs, then the security issues are going to get bigger, because we're a young continent with young people who need jobs. If they don't have jobs, what are they going to do? They cannot all japa. They cannot all go, seek somebody. So I think we can't let these things that are happening, which are reality. Yes, America has strategic interest in the minerals in DRC. China has strategic interest in others. Saudi Arabia has strategic interest in the arable land. So there is always going to be that interest. And go back to your original question, is Africa strategic? Yes, it is. Unfortunately, it seems to be strategic to outside interests. And what we're trying to do is make it strategic to inside interests, by looking to how we can take advantage of this time where there is an opportunity. The world is re-globalizing. The rules have been changed. The government's been changed. So we can have a chance to actually move up the curve because of what we have that everybody wants. That's going to require governments thinking less about political rhetoric and more about industrial policy. That's going to require investment in education, real education, not political education, but the skills of the needs. That's going to require supporting the fintechs that are growing in Accra, in Nairobi, and in Lagos, and supporting them. That's going to require making clever use of the funds that are available. But we can argue that it's terrible that big countries continue to exploit Africa. But there will, whether we react properly or not. It would just be worse if we don't start building up our own capital, our own indigenous businesses.
Yeah, I mean, one of the kind of common themes over the years has been that this is there is a large geopolitical plot against to undermine Africa. I'm sure everybody in this forum has come across this to some extent. I'm of the opinion that we do this to ourselves to a great extent, but I mean that's a conversation for another day. But we do have to learn how to say no. And then there is, of course, this assumption everybody makes that the government of the day, in whichever country you pick, their primary goal is to increase the welfare of the average person. This is an assumption we are all making. Whereas it turns out, and I'm not exaggerating, that in many cases the government of the day's primary concern is how to make the government of the day wealthier rather than the people. You have to kind of who comes first. My family comes first. Nepotism is rife. I don't have to explain this to anybody, I think, in this room, that we have this tendency to redistribute the wealth amongst particular classes, and intentionally so. It's not even some small percentage. It happened a lot. So, but I still think that we need to talk about the issue of picking up, and we're coming back to the issue, the Zambian president saying we don't have to pick a side. I want to address this because if you join the value chain dominated by one particular bloc, whichever bloc that is, does that really preclude you from supplying the other bloc or a third bloc which might appear in a few years' time? I think this is can this be legally done? Is this something that I'm not sure. So I want to put this out to you. Let's start with Thomas. What do you think?
So I think that's a good question. I think one thing to first start with is that a lot of these major global value chains, though they might be or have parts of the value chain that are dominated by, say, one of these powers like China, but there's a lot of integration even between the two major blocs as of right now for a lot of these value chains, right? So a lot of raw materials might make their way through China to be processed and refined and turned into components and things like that. But a lot of those value chains end with companies from the United States and the European countries as well, right? So you have a lot of integration even within value chains that I think make that question a little bit challenging in the sense that whether countries in Africa might need to choose a side would depend upon kind of how intense that rivalry between blocs becomes, and in part whether there is any kind of significant decoupling within some of these value chains, right? So if there comes to be an emergence of actual kind of two separate GVCs that align with each of these blocs, then the situation might become one in which choosing a side becomes a necessity. At the same time, you could also point out that when we're talking about some of these resources, a lot of the mining operations themselves, and again, the processing of minerals and so forth, all runs mostly through China, predominantly, right? So in that sense, is there already some degree of alignment in which China has an upper hand, at least in moving from the sort of primary to the intermediate stages as of right now, and that the US and other powers lag behind in certain ways. So I would say that it would be to the benefit to play both sides for as long as it's feasible, because you get different types of investment from the US and from China, and those could stand to benefit. At the same time, it risks some of these countries becoming sort of in the crosshairs of this overall conflict. And if that conflict becomes more intense, then they're in a position of vulnerability, perhaps.
Yeah, I see your point, but I also feel that once so this is it's like somebody paying for my wedding, and then me saying, well, you can't decide who's coming to the party, you know. And this is um, I mean, this is really kind of you borrowed all this money from one side, and they paid for your railways, or but whether it's a Lobido corridor or it's the BRI, and then say no, I'm going to focus on the one who's paying more, and that's not you. Um, I can think of some choice abuses that would come out of the mouth of that person, if not, a slipper will come off and you'll be hitting the person on the head. That's what I would see. So, really, does this work? Let me turn to Roland.
I think in the context of Africa, it works, Prof, because you talk of Lobito. It's again, I would argue, sort of a colonial infrastructure because it's extracting from the copper belt through Angola. But on the opposite end is the Tazara Railway, which is also extracting from the copper belt to the other ocean. One could argue, here we go, we're back to how things have always been. But there's obviously job creation, there's infrastructure being built, and the challenge for the African country, whether it's Zambia, Tanzania, or Angola, is because they are not getting to value add on stuff that's coming from under their ground. They're not able to then have the ability to repay that money or to have the voice. Just Ziad's gone now, but obviously an example is what's happening in Nigeria. And I just picked up on John's comment. So the refinery is built and it starts working. And then a year ago, I think the announcement is made that all purchases are in Naira. Now, there's two things happening. The oil is being purchased in Naira. The refinery is refining this oil into finished products, which are now being exported into neighboring Nigerian countries. So can Africa do it? We can. But the legacies that hinder our participation, especially intra-Africa, they remain. And everybody who comes in. So where our challenge is, you talked about as a unilateral, your earlier point, why can't a country do something? Ghana tried to do this with cocoa bean, and the European Union said, fantastic, but this is what happens when you go up a value addition stage. So they had to relent and continue to export this raw cocoa bean. We have the capacity, we have the means. I think it's just building on Sam's point about us building ourselves up to this point where we go into implementation, because we can do it. We can. At the end of the day, right? So the African Union, the Assembly, which is the most powerful part of the organization, this is the heads of the sovereign states. So they are taking action unilaterally, if you want, but by coming together, creating a space for the continent. So I think it's possible, but it's not going to be easy.
I think, yeah, two things. One, a while ago, I had a webinar about agricultural value adding, and we had someone from Olam, which is, some of you may know, is on the largest commodities purchaser in Africa, probably the world nowadays, and they dominate the cocoa industry. They do the intermediate processing, 60% of the. And the gentleman was saying that, you know, one of the reasons that goes against Ghana taking a significant role in actually doing anything is that you need to grow different kinds of cocoa beans. It's not there is a blend. They use a blend nowadays, and just processing the one kind of bean is not really a practical option available to these companies. Now that is, but of course, and again, the others are gone, and we have a couple of Ghanaian people who are engaged with this conversation. So, not understanding the industry, it's not the same industry. The cocoa industry doesn't function the way it worked 30 years ago. You know, and GVCs are different from the way, you know, we had this FDI, Cadbury would come or whatever, Hershey's would come. That's no longer the case. There's no single value chain. So there is that point. But I come to the point, you brought up the Dangote refinery. And I think that is indeed an example where business takes the lead and ignores the absence of state structures that that are impeding them. And I know to some extent there are challenges to that model, and Dangote, you know, himself struggles with fighting vested interests in Nigeria. Sam, I think I will let you speak on this.
No, thank you. I mean, I think, yes, I think the Dangote example is is a brilliant example of what is possible and what can be done. And let's be fair, he's not just done it in Nigeria. He is investing across the continent at his own risk. Yes, but I wouldn't say he's ignoring governments. He works with governments where it is possible. Sometimes he has to work against governments, but to get it done. But it just that's the reality of making capital investment. But I just want to take up this point of picking sides. You know, unfortunately, it just has echoes of it. It almost seems as if the Berlin Wall never fell. You know, I'm not sure I really understand why we have to always think in terms of, you know, I don't even like the idea non-aligned states. That is so sort of 1950s, 60s, or whatever which we've seen where that got us. I mean, the developed world forgot ideologies for a while and made money. Now it's rediscovered ideologies and it's using them to make even more money. And we're still at the bottom of the smile curve of value chains. So that tells me that we may be having the wrong arguments. We may be having the wrong discussions. Um, I don't know whether, yeah, I mean, your wedding analogy is interesting, but I'm not quite sure where that fits in with economics, because the reality is that, you know, if America wants to buy Zambian copper, it will negotiate a price. If it can get a better price from China, they will sell to China or to Europe. I actually think I find it somewhat amusing when Europeans get upset because African countries are doing business with people they say they don't like, but they do business with, as Thomas has pointed out. So I actually think this side, choosing sides, is a bit of a red herring. The reality is that who is going to bring the capital and help me get where I want to get to? Who is going to be there? You know, the last two presidents have shown that political sciences are matters of convenience. Mr. Khan has learned that very recently, and he's acting very, you know, he's having to deal with that. Who would have thought that Canada and USA would, you know, would be in this situation? So I think we're having the wrong discussion if we're talking about choosing political sides. The issue is, what can we do to attract the investment? What can we do to reduce the cost of doing business in our countries? What can we do to make our countries more attractive, either to internal investors who are who are taking their money outside of Africa because it's safer havens? What can we do to find more Dangotes? What can we do to find more Patrice Motsepes? What can we do to encourage local entrepreneurship? Because that's when you then, in fact, I think even MNCs are, if we can build a proper ecosystem, their costs will be reduced because they don't have to do so much themselves. So there's a win-win for everybody if we actually do it, focus on the right things.
Yes, you know, I think that there, as you say, I think what the lesson we're learning here is that businesses, if left to their own devices and given the right incentives and the right environment, can do stuff. I mean, there's no question that that African businesses can succeed for the very simple reason that which I point to people is that we're all normally distributed. No, in terms of intelligence, I can speak with great authority in the matter after 60 odd years alive, having lived everywhere. There is absolutely no difference. There's no longer tail in any place. The only reason is opportunity. Only problem difference is opportunity, education. That's pretty much it. The only difference is one finds wherever one goes. And of course, Dangote has had a few benefits of coming out of from a family of incredibly wealthy people. Certainly, that is a good start. It's like where did you get your first million from type of thing. As Bill Gates the third, anyone with numbers at the end of the name did not make their first million themselves. That is the same thing with Dangote. He is in fact coming from a place of privilege, but nonetheless, the fact that he has been able to do so says something, and it says something for what can be done. How we can get away from the fact that we have governments which end up, and that's where Dangote is. How can we get away from government which has self-interest at its heart? I'm not worried about being arrested by the Nigerian government for saying that. But there is that challenge, and that's not just a unique challenge to Nigeria. To some extent, it is across the continent. There are a number of countries where legitimate business, is challenged by the business interests of government, or the business interests of politicians, and that really kind of comes to. Now, there's nothing anyone outside can do, in my opinion, or is there? I mean, what are the small steps? I would think about baby steps because, yes, we can have this dream of African Union and we can do things. We can say there will be no borders across Africa and all that stuff. But these are baby steps because we have been trying baby steps for. We need to start small. We've got a few minutes left, and I know that a number of people are going to break their fast in 15 minutes time. Let's come. Let me do a round go around the room. What can be done? Baby steps. What would you say if I have the ear of a minister, which I do, or two? Tell me what should I say to them? Let's start with Roland.
So I would say one word, or two words rather, do it, which is from the global phase where a lot of African countries are signed up members of the United Nations. You have the SDGs. It sounds distant. You bring it down to the continent. All 55 are signed up to the Agenda 2063. There's, of course, the mismatch because 2063 is an aspirational delivery date. But we have a real problem as a continent, which is by 2050, the population doubles. So we don't have the time to be waiting for 20. We have to do things now. The things we are doing now is that pre-AFCFTA, the regional economic communities, have been taking actions. Now there's a mismatch because EAC, for example, is 100% if you want integrated. Others are not. The AFCFTA is a mechanism to try and correct this and bring everybody to the same level. So we have the tools, we have the plumbing, it's in place. I would say tell the minister to say let's implement these tools, and if done, there will be a pain period, no doubt. To your earlier comment of the bigger countries versus the smaller countries, at least a 3-year period. 3 to 5 year period of pain and squeeze, but it settles down once people understand what we're trying to do here. Because in 2050, we shouldn't be having these conversations. We should be looking at what's worked and what's not worked.
I'm just going to preface that because you bring up this very important issue of the demographic bifurcation. That is to say, we are, sub-Saharan Africa has a massively growing youthful population and a shrinking aging population, which some people call a demographic dividend. But, it isn't a dividend because if you don't have jobs, you have a very large population of angry young men. And angry young men are known to cause revolution, if not a revolution, anarchy. Nobody needs anarchy. So this is one of the big questions that no one in Africa, most African countries are not addressing systematically, is this demographic curse, which is, if nothing is done, it will be a curse. And so it's definitely a topic for next one of our next webinars. But yes, I thought I'd bring that up. Thank you. Let me turn to Thomas. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that some of the steps that could be important here. I mean, we talked a lot about multilateralism and the potential there, as well as weaknesses. I think a lot of important steps will hinge upon, some of what the regional players decide to do relative to multilateralism. You have in each of these sort of regional blocs, oftentimes individual countries that are kind of in leadership positions here, responsible for sort of the glue that keeps the regional bloc together. And so I think there's a lot of pressure there for those players to not only consider their own interests, but think about the regional collective interests, as we've talked about.
But let me interrupt you, Thomas. Coming to you're answering Roland's point. My point is, what do I tell my friend the minister? What should baby steps?
Baby steps. I mean, I think you have to to proceed with a sort of bottom-up approach to things, right? I think looking too much to sort of how you're being guided or influenced by the large global players is going to come at a cost, and attempting to extract from those relationships as much as you can in terms of investment, but at the same time thinking about how to make those internal developments, as we've talked about in education, infrastructure, creating a more favorable business environment. Internally, those will be the better longer term steps, as opposed to relying too much upon what these larger alignments can do for the country.
And Ziad has turned up at a very opportune moment. Of course, the question I'm going around the table asking is what simple advice or simple urging would you give should you have the chance to speak to a minister tomorrow or today? What would you say? Baby steps can be done. What can be done to help business? Remember, we're thinking again that business can drive the story. What can the government do? What can you say? What will be useful to them? Ziad, before you break your fast.
I think we don't need any more regulations. All we need is implementation on what is there. If you ever see any of the ministers who are in charge of implementing, they have to enforce the rules which they have signed on. That is why a group of us have bundled together in order to drive the Make Africa Borderless Now campaign, which is moving around to gather 10 million signatures for African leaders to sign and to commit on what they have signed to. Actually, not to sign, to implement and to enforce what they committed to implement. And we are going to submit this petition. These 10 million signatures, if collected, to the African Union's heads of state meeting next year in February. So we have given ourselves this target. Regional integration is not the domain of the elite. It is actually for the people to demand implementation and enforcement, whether it is the free movement protocol, or whether it is the single African air transport market, or the implementation of the free movement protocol, or the AFCFTA. All of it is signed. All that is left is the implementation. So that would be my call.
Okay. Sam, you get the last word. 3 minutes, no more. I want to close on time.
I won't take 3 minutes. I don't know how big your baby is. I think my first point was Ziad's point. I think I was going to call it regulatory harmonization. In other words, do what you already got and stop making up new rules that just make life a lot more difficult and complicated. But I would say sort out power. If you sort out power, a lot of the tradesmen, the little, just like we sorted out communications, ICT, sort out power, a lot was sorted out. And just don't just mean Nigeria. I think South Africa needs to sort out power, and a few other places. If you sort that out, that unleashes a lot. You don't have to do that much more. And I think I would also talk to my colleagues in the finance industry and insurance industry, say, let's do our part, because we can't expect people to go into business and be paying 30% interest rates or to negotiate some ridiculous issues to do. And there's a lot we can do. There's a lot that has been done. I think the banking industry has come a long way. The insurance industry needs to go a lot further. And I speak as one of them. We haven't done enough. There's a lot we can do. We need the ministers to take away some of the impediments and make sure there's some clearer rules. And as Ziad said, implement the ones that already exist. If you do that, you reduce the risk environment, you reduce the cost of doing business for quite a lot of people, and you create not necessarily a safety net, but an easier landing for businesses, which gives them a better chance of actually surviving and creating value.
Thank you, Sam. That is, I think, a very good place for us to draw this to an end. There's so many questions, I have to say. I apologize to the audience. We haven't had enough time to engage. Some of them will start entire new steps and new conversations. I mean, we have someone who pointed out that maybe a revolution is a good thing, and that the angry young people will then do great things. I have my doubts about that. Revolutions often just fizzle out. We have had the Arab Spring, which led absolutely nowhere. So, but it is something, it's another conversation to be had. I think that everyone seems to point the same direction. Reduce the burden of, create economic freedom, I think, or create the freedom to conduct business, and provide the infrastructure, the environment. I think this seems to be the bottom line. It doesn't matter what industry is, we're talking about, whether it's mining or and it's not about countries. It's a continent-wide problem, and it's a continent-wide problem also that the first step, is to start there and then think about upgrading and improving the added value. If you don't feel safe getting out of bed, the rational economic actor is going to stay in bed. It's a rational thing to stay in bed. It's a rational thing not to take your wallet out. It's a rational thing not to invest. It's a rational thing not to negotiate for the greater good. You will negotiate for yourself. That's why, how it works. It is rational to behave badly when that is the environment in which you are. Now, I know I sound like I'm going to lead my own revolution, but that's not the case. I think we are opening the conversation for yet further conversations. Our tagline here, what matters really matters for African business. And we'll continue in this line of thought. I think that it's time for iftar for a number of people. I don't want to hold you back. And I'd like to thank my speakers for a wonderful and rather engaging conversation. To everybody, see you again, see you soon, and thank you for your patience.
The Dunning Africa Center. It's not a place, it's a continent-wide conversation. Join us as we ask the pressing questions facing African business today.